In 1701, Captain Kidd was condemned as a pirate.
Arch pirate and the common enemy of mankind.
But with his death, the mystery of Kidd's hidden treasure was born.
Kidd was the only one who actually buried his treasure.
Over the centuries, many adventurers have tried to find his hoard. No one tried harder than Englishman Richard Knight.
He got taken over by the ghost of Captain Kidd.
This is a tale of epic sea voyages, unimaginable riches lost, secret compartments found, hidden treasure maps where X marks the spot, clues to the buried millions.
And I said, "Have you really found it, Richard?" And he said, "Yes, I have."
But Knight's daring expedition lands him in a Vietnamese jail, fearing for his life. He risked everything to unearth Captain Kidd's legendary treasure. Richard Knight was an unlikely treasure hunter. He was born in a quiet English seaside town, but he was destined not to lead a conventional, quiet life.
He was a curious figure, Richard Knight. I mean, he was not like many people you meet these days. You may perhaps have met them in the 19th century, but I don't think you met them in the 20th century, and probably even less now.
Knight was a young man in the early 1960s when he moved to Paris. As a bon vivant, he enjoyed all that the city and the changing times had to offer.
He was an adventurer, a chancer. I think that he wanted to enjoy life. He wanted to have seen everything, experienced everything.
But Richard Knight was an entertainer, an actor. And he had come to Paris not just to have fun, but to study with the master of French mime, Marcel Marceau. He even had some success in his career. Knight played opposite the great Jacques Tati in his film comedy Playtime as a confused drunk. But it seems he never settled anywhere for long.
He was happiest with the rucksack on his back. He was always footloose and fancy-free.
By 1978, Knight had travelled to Hollywood in an attempt to further his career as an actor. He never imagined his life was about to be given an entirely new direction. Not by a casting director, but by the actions of a man 300 years earlier. Captain William Kidd.
Suddenly he was inhabited by the ghost of Captain Kidd, another chancer from a much earlier century. And that's what I think happened to Richard. He got obsessed by the ghost of Captain Kidd.
Richard Knight was a voracious reader, and the books in the UCLA library drew him deeper and deeper into the extraordinary story of the infamous pirate. A tale of hardship and ill fortune, full of surprises.
Kidd was born in Dundee on the east coast of Scotland around 1655, but he went to New York, and it was there that he became a seaman, and he essentially worked his way up right through the ranks from a cabin boy to a sea captain. He became one of the best respected sea captains in the Americas.
In an unexpected twist, Knight discovered that when Captain Kidd sailed from London in February 1696, it was not as a pirate, but the very opposite, a pirate hunter, working for a consortium of wealthy English aristocrats and merchants. Britain's flourishing economy was largely built on trade with India. The ships of the British East India Company had been making huge profits, but the company had a growing problem: pirates. Disaster struck when English pirate Captain Avery teamed up with 5 other pirate captains to attack the Indian Mughal Emperor's convoy. They took a mammoth haul of over 500,000 gold and silver coins. The furious Mughal Emperor retaliated. His army attacked the company, and he threatened to put an end to English trade in India altogether. Captain William Kidd was commissioned by the British to hunt the pirates down. Not as an officer in the Royal Navy, but as a privateer.
A privateer is somebody who has a ship and a crew who gets a license, a letter of marque, to go out and hunt down the enemies of the state.
Kidd was given command of a newly built, powerful ship, the 34-gun Adventure Galley. So great was the crisis that Kidd's letter of marque, giving him permission to seize pirates, their ships, and their treasure in the king's name, was signed by King William III himself.
He was a well-respected, hard, experienced sea captain. He felt he had the skills and the ship and the expertise to pull this one off.
Kidd also had an added bonus. Britain was at war with France, so he could seize any enemy French ships he found. It was a confident Captain Kidd who set sail in the expectation that his share of the spoils would soon make him rich in captured ships and treasure. And the crew were also eager.
It was actually one of the best, most lucrative opportunities that these people had in the late 17th century.
The crew drew no pay. Their reward was a share of any ships and cargo taken, a system called no prey, no pay. Captain Kidd's 18-month privateer cruise was expected to pay from £500 to £3,500 per man, when the wage of a merchant seaman was just £45 a year.
An average seaman could actually make a small fortune from one good prize, one very lucrative prize. His normal cut would be enough to probably set himself up in business. He could buy a tavern, he could buy a farm, but essentially it was the big payload available to the late 17th century seaman.
As the Adventure Galley rounded the Horn of Africa, cannon at the ready, Kidd was expecting to encounter and conquer the pirates in their popular haunts off Madagascar and in the Indian Ocean. But there was a serious problem. They weren't there.
By the time he got to the Indian Ocean, all the ships he encountered were ones of allies, were English or Dutch ships. He couldn't find pirates, he couldn't find Frenchmen. So as the months rolled by and the crew weren't getting paid, things started to go badly wrong for him.
At the end of their planned 18-month cruise, not a single pirate ship or substantial French prize had been taken. The rebellious crew wanted to raid the next ship they came across. Any ship. They wanted to turn pirate.
When the crew knew they only earned money by taking other ships, they tended to take ships that maybe they shouldn't have.
The Adventure Galley had been at sea for 2 years with little to show for it. The crew took to torturing prisoners to find cash aboard any ships they encountered. Damning accounts from southern African ports where these ships fled began to arrive in London and New York. Captain Kidd was labelled pirate, and that meant the death penalty at the end of a rope. Knight learned that to calm his mutinous crew, enrich his powerful backers in London and save his own skin, Kidd needed a miracle. One big ship, pirate or French, loaded to the gunwales. As if in answer to Kidd's prayers, a cry rang out from the masthead. A ship had been sighted. a large, heavily laden merchant ship.
In January 1698, he hit the jackpot. He found a ship called the Quetta Merchant, which contained a lot of valuable silks, gold jewellery. It was the mother lode. At last he'd found the right ship.
The Quetta Merchant was no fighting pirate ship, but when her captain showed him French papers, Kidd could snap her up as a legitimate prize. The riches aboard the Quetta Merchant are well documented. On board were pounds of gold, silver and jewels, as well as bales of fine silk and opium. Valued at up to £400,000 at the time, over £60 million today. Kidd's hunt for treasure was over. Now he could return home to New York in triumph to remove the stain on his reputation that he had turned pirate. But what seemed to be Kidd's salvation turned out to be a disaster. In New York, Kidd was swiftly arrested. The Quetta Merchant was not French, but belonged to a powerful Indian trader. Captain Kidd, who had been sent pirate hunting to pacify the Indian Mughals, had instead made the situation much worse. After capturing their treasure ship, the Indian merchants were demanding Kidd's blood. The British government were determined to pacify the all-powerful Indian merchants and desperate to safeguard the lucrative Far East trade. To buy his freedom, Kidd told of a treasure chest he'd buried on a nearby island. When the governor of New York, Lord Bellamont, dug it up, he found £14,000 in gold and jewels, worth today £2 million. But it bought Kidd no reprieve. The Indian emperor was baying for Kidd's blood, and the hapless Captain Kidd was shipped back to England to face trial for piracy and the hangman's rope.
This was no ordinary trial. This wasn't justice. This was retribution. His name was so blackened that everyone just thought, this man's a pirate.
Kidd's big mistake was to fail to copy the French pass he was given when he captured the Quetta Merchant. Without it, he couldn't prove that he had seized the ship legitimately. Now, at trial, when he needed it most, the French pass was nowhere to be seen.
The crucial piece of evidence, those French passes, which proved that he'd been behaving legitimately, had mysteriously disappeared. So he was essentially hung out to dry.
And Kidd faced not only a trial for piracy. Just to make sure he met the hangman, they also tried him for murder. In the darkest days of Kidd's voyage, when he was struggling to contain his rebellious crew's piratical exploits, a fatal incident occurred. The Adventure Galley encountered a Dutch ship, a British ally, and when Kidd refused to attack her, the crew were close to mutiny.
The gunner was the ringleader of a rather mutinous group of the crew who just wanted to capture it and ransack it, and that's when Kidd came to blows with the gunner.
Kidd, in his rage, grabbed an iron-bound wooden bucket and swung it at the argumentative gunner. The pail struck the gunner in the head, knocking him unconscious. Kidd had quelled the mutiny, but next day, the gunner died.
Killing a gunner is not a normal step for a sea captain, but in the instance of mutiny, those things are acceptable. And while Kidd knew he'd gone pretty far, he certainly didn't expect to be accused of murder for it.
In court, 2 of Kidd's former crew were given an amnesty to turn against him. They declared on oath that Kidd's fatal attack on the gunner had been premeditated murder.
The whole thing was just raced through so that they wanted a verdict, and they wanted one particular verdict, which is Kidd had to hang.
On the 9th of May 1701, Captain William Kidd was sentenced to be hanged. In a desperate attempt to escape his fate, he played what he hoped was a trump card. From his cell in Newgate Jail, he wrote a pleading letter to the government bargaining for his life.
I do most humbly pray that you will be pleased to represent to the Honourable House of Commons that in my late proceedings in the Indies I have lodged goods and treasure to the value of £100,000, which I desire the government may have the benefit of.
Kidd was claiming he'd hidden a second, much greater treasure, what would now be worth £15 million, and that if they would spare his life, he would lead them to it.
That's the germ that's sparked the interest of a lot of sort of treasure hunters ever since.
It was in this letter that the legend of Captain Kidd's vast buried treasure was born. So certain was Kidd about the hoard, he made it clear that they should hang him if he did not deliver.
If I fail therein, I desire no favour, but to be forthwith executed according to my sentence. Sir, your unfortunate humble servant, William Kidd.
The government, however, stood to lose a far greater sum than £15 million. All trade with India. It did not take the bait. The Indian moguls had to be appeased with Kidd's very public death. Under the rules of the Admiralty, Captain Kidd was taken onto the Thames foreshore at Wapping, London, between the low tide and the high water mark, to be hanged. But his execution did not go smoothly. When he was turned off the ladder, the rope snapped.
He must have thought he's actually had the first lucky break he's had for about 6 years, where often that's seen as a legitimate reprieve. In Kidd's case, he was just marched back up onto the scaffold, a new rope was found, and he was shoved off into oblivion.
The Admiralty, however, did not consider merely hanging pirates enough of a deterrent. Kidd's body was chained to a post in the Thames until the tide had washed over it 3 times. The body, painted with pitch, hung for over 2 years in a gibbet by the Thames estuary as a warning to passing sailors not to turn pirate. But the legend of Kidd's treasure would never die. Almost 300 years later, in Santa Monica, on the coast of Southern California, Richard Knight was hooked by the mystery of where Kidd's treasure lay buried. And he was determined to find it. Knight launched his treasure quest from the University of California, Los Angeles Library. From that moment on, his life was changed forever.
He got this idea, this obsession in his mind, and from then on he focused on it. Rich was a fairly rare character in that he really wasn't interested in money. He talks about the value of kids' treasure and being millions and countless millions. But I think it was the attraction of the adventure to him.
As Knight investigated, he found that others had dreamed of finding Kidd's treasure. And like them, he discovered that Kidd had left behind a trail of clues. Kidd's treasure trail starts in 1929 on the south coast of England in Eastbourne. It was the hometown of middle-aged bachelor Hubert Palmer. He was a retired solicitor who loved to collect pirate relics.
One day in 1929, he came in possession of an old oak bureau that was reputedly once belonged to Captain Kidd. And it had a brass plate attached to the front, William Kidd, Adventure Galley, 1696.
Whilst writing at the bureau one day, Palmer must have leant on it a little more than usual. One of the supporting runners broke off.
When Palmer examined it, he saw on the end, in wax, a very small impression of an anchor. He guessed something must be inside this runner, so he carefully took the wax imprint from the end, and inside he found a brass tube.
Knight discovered that Palmer had found wrapped around the brass tube a parchment. It was a map, a treasure map. On it, X marked the spot, just as in the story Treasure Island. But there was more. At the top were the words China Sea, on the left a compass north bearing, and at the bottom Kidd's initials, WK.
Palmer immediately suspected that this possibly was the hiding place of Kidd's treasure. But of course, there was nothing on the chart to say where it was.
Far from telling Knight where Kidd's treasure was, Palmer's chart left him with a fascinating glimpse of a mystery. His head buzzed with questions of how to solve it. Fortunately, in the 1930s, Hubert Palmer had uncovered more clues.
After that, Palmer devoted a lot of his time and energies to advertising for anything to do with Kidd, any relics, any chests, boxes, anything, hoping to find further evidence of where this island might be.
Knight learned that Palmer advertised for any objects belonging to Kidd, and slowly he found them.
3 years after Palmer found the oak bureau, he was offered this chest.
The chest came from a nautical man, Captain Morgan, who claimed descent from notorious buccaneer Sir Henry Morgan. Another of his light-fingered ancestors had been jailer at Newgate Prison, and when Kidd was hanged, the jailer took the chest.
He could see inlaid in brass on the top of the lid a skull and crossbones and the letter K. On opening the chest, he was amazed to see inside, attached to a false bottom, a plaster cast skull fixed to a plaster cast Bible. It is believed the skull was there for the crew to swear allegiance to the captain or the crown, hand on the skull with a Bible in the hand.
Disappointingly, the false bottom was empty, but there was something else mysterious there. When Palmer turned the board over, he discovered a mirror. What was it doing there?
Palmer examined the beading around here and discovered that This particular part of the beading quite easily came off. He was then able to slide the mirror and out like that. And lo and behold, to his great excitement, there was another chart.
Knight, just like Palmer, was excited by the fact that the outline of this chart was almost identical to the first one, but it contained more information.
515 southeast by 50 north, 36 northeast rocks, 3 feet by 3 feet by 4.
Knight now became convinced these were directions to the treasure. But apart from the clue China Sea, he had no idea of the island's whereabouts. No latitude or longitude. He needed more. Fortunately for Knight, Palmer had another piece of extraordinary good luck. When 2 years later, he was able to buy a chest that once belonged to Captain Kidd's wife, Sarah.
This is known as Sarah Kidd's workbox. There is an inlaid brass plate on the top which says William and Sarah Kidd, their box, 1699.
Meticulous as always, Palmer measured the box inside and out. There was a discrepancy, leading him to suspect a secret compartment in the base.
Palmer discovered on the end that there were 2 or 3 hidden nails or screws disguised in there. He eventually managed to undo these and work this beading edge off, and this revealed the hidden compartment underneath. He probed inside and discovered a parchment showing another chart.
This chart was more detailed. Knight first tried to decipher what had to be Kidd's own writing around the map's edge. After much puzzling, he had it.
360 yards, veer right, north 3 stumps, 87 feet from the centre of triangle in left rocks, 98, 20 feet east of skeleton of Leeb.
The final word remained a mystery, but Knight knew these were more detailed instructions of where to find the buried treasure. Crucially, this chart showed latitude and longitude. Knight now had what he needed, a way to pinpoint the island itself. But there was a snag. The longitude was hard to read. If the longitude was read as 3130 east, that put the island in the Sudan. Perhaps the mark before 31 could be a figure 1. But 131.30 east put the island 200 miles off the Philippines in open ocean. Knight realized there was a fundamental problem with the longitude. The modern maps Knight examined used the International Zero Meridian passing through the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, London. But then he realized charts in Captain Kidd's time referenced other zero meridians. The French favoured Paris, the Spanish Cadiz. The high mountain of Tenerife was also popular with seafarers. The longitude of the treasure island would depend on which chart Kidd had been using.
So when looking at a chart of the 17th century or earlier, you had to know what meridian was in use at that time. And that's one of the problems with these charts. What meridian did Kidd use?
Richard Knight began to study atlases from the 16th to the 18th century. They were beautiful and ornate, and none recorded longitude from the zero meridian at Greenwich. Knight applied the Kidd treasure map longitudes. The first, 3130 east, put the island in Nigeria. No good at all. But the second longitude, 131.30 east, indicated the island lay somewhere between Burma and the Philippines. That meant the South China Sea. This was more like it. China Sea, just as on the Kidd treasure maps.
Slowly he put together this idea that he had solved the mystery that nobody else had.
Knight now consulted chart after chart, scanning thousands of islands, looking for an island that matched the old parchments. Then, at last, on French Admiralty Hydrographic Chart number 3686 of 1879, there it was. Hon Tre Lon. Right shape, right orientation, right name. Hon Tre Lon is called in English Grand Pirate Island. But it was right in the worst possible spot imaginable. Hon Tre Lon was in the territorial waters of a country which, after a long bitter war with the USA, was hostile to Westerners. Communist Vietnam.
Nobody had looked there because of the Vietnam War, because they were communist, because the politics had changed. It wasn't a place where you did pitch up and suddenly look for treasure. So he decided that he was the person who was going to brave all the odds and go and prove to the world that his theory was right.
International treasure hunting is an expensive business. Knight, looking to fund his expedition to Kidd's forbidden treasure island, set out his stall in Sydney, Australia. Using all his skills as an entertainer and storyteller, he tried to lure wealthy Australian businessmen into his romantic quest.
Of course, he was always on the lookout for a backer who might help. So, he used to pick up these extraordinary figures, go off with them, trying to persuade them that to come in with him to this sort of madcap mission.
Slowly, Richard Knight managed to draw together a small group to buy into his dreams of treasure. But his charm would never convince the Vietnamese government to let him go on a treasure hunt. He would need a cover story. To explain his need for a metal detector without arousing suspicion, Knight and his backers decided to write asking for official permission to prospect for minerals. On a business letter headed the Australian Pacific Geological and Mining Company, they made their pitch, ending,
hoping we may have your favourable consideration for this application, as we believe that it may have considerable interest and potential benefit to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
It didn't work. There was no reply from the Vietnamese. Knight decided through a travel agent to simply ask to visit Hon Tre Lon as a tourist. This time he did get a reply, but it exactly followed the Communist Party line.
We regret the areas you have stipulated in your request are not now possible to visit. Only published areas through our approved agency in Australia possible.
The political climate of the Cold War left no legitimate way for Richard Knight to get to Hon Tre Lon. Gradually, his backers backed away.
And so he was now left on his own. And all his backers dropped out. And rather than say, well, I'm not going to do this until I've got it properly organised, he thought, well, what the hell? I'm going to do it myself.
By June 1981, Richard Knight had decided that the only way to reach his treasure island was to mount an illegal expedition. The first step of his personal invasion was to get as close to Vietnam as he could. He decided to base himself in Bangkok, Thailand. But this was still over 300 miles by sea from Hon Tre Lon, a very dangerous voyage. Finding a boat for hire that was large enough but inconspicuous enough to sneak him within striking distance of Hon Tre Lon would be tricky. On top of that, he had to find a willing crew.
I think Rich found it difficult to persuade totally legitimate, solid citizens to go in with him because of his nonchalant character, his habit of whizzing off and disappearing, or not being totally practical, perhaps, or they came to that view. And so he was thrust on unusual characters like himself.
Knight now took a leaf out of Captain Kidd's book, offering a share of the treasure. But still, he could induce no one to volunteer for such a risky voyage. Then a friend introduced him to a fresh-faced 18-year-old American, Fred Graham.
But in the end he found, the perfect person, really, a young photojournalist who also wanted an adventure.
Fred Graham had left home in California with a new camera to become a war photographer. But with no experience, he couldn't break into the profession. He was at a dead end, and Richard Knight's treasure hunt offered just the kind of excitement he was looking for. Knight offered him 15% of the treasure. Graham negotiated his share up to 40%. They had a deal. But just like Kidd's crew, if they found no treasure, he would get nothing. The decision to go with Knight would cost him dear. Just 2 days later, towards the end of May 1983, Knight and Graham were in high spirits as they set their bow into the Gulf of Thailand. Knight had persuaded a local crew to accept his bizarre charter, and they were off on their adventure to unearth the legendary treasure of Captain Kidd. It took several days and nights to reach the island Knight had picked out from the old charts. But fortune seemed to smile on the voyage. The Gulf was the haunt of real 20th century cutthroat pirates. Knight and Graham were well equipped for treasure hunting with a metal detector and digging equipment, but not for rappelling boarders. But they passed through without incident. After days at sea, Knight and Graham landed on their treasure island. Knight's crazy plan seemed to be working rather well. All was quiet, and Knight decided that they would wait until first light to unearth the legendary treasure of Captain Kidd. It had, after all, waited almost 300 years. It could surely wait one more night. But what he didn't know was, they'd been seen. Vietnamese had endless questions to fire at Richard Knight. Who are you? Where are you from? What is this equipment for? Any answers to do with treasure hunting were met with scorn. They were convinced he was an American spy working for the Western imperialist CIA. Knight and Graham were imprisoned in rat and cockroach-infested cells, separated in solitary confinement. If Knight couldn't overturn the spy story, he faced a similar fate to Captain Kidd: execution. Again and again he was interrogated. Again and again he had another confession to sign. What he told them of his globe-trotting acting career was to them an elaborate cover story. What is all this equipment for? Who, they kept asking him, was his contact in the British government? Richard Knight didn't have a contact in the British government. He wished he had. Not a soul even knew he was missing, let alone where he was and the danger he was in. Captain Kidd at least had treasure to bargain with. Knight had nothing. More than once, when the militia took him from his cell, Knight believed that he was to be shot.
I think he weathered jail quite well. He had all sorts of diversionary tactics to fall back on.
He took to playing imaginary games of golf, reliving visits to Blackpool, analysing gambling systems and besting imaginary opponents with a homemade pack of cards.
He could always find something within himself to withstand those long solitary and potentially dangerous situations, largely because there's a huge imagination, I think.
But as month after month passed, Knight fought for his sanity. He gave each corner of the cell a function, one to look to the future, another to look to the past, one for prayer, another for comedy. But after 4 months with no contact from either the British or US governments, it seemed he might never get out alive. But he was unaware there was one faint hope. Just before the ill-fated treasure hunt, young Fred Graham had wisely arranged for a letter to be posted to his father if he wasn't back in 30 days. He wrote,
If you're reading this letter, something has gone very wrong. Either I am dead or in prison.
Graham's letter saved them both. With the news that Knight and Graham had gone to Vietnam, the British and US embassies launched investigations. The Minister of State at the Foreign Office, Richard Luce, also the Knight's local MP, wrote to Knight's mother.
You can rest assured that the embassy will continue to press the Vietnamese to let them know where your son is being held.
The diplomatic activity worked. The Vietnamese admitted they had arrested Knight and Graham for violating the territory of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and they were in prison. But now the Vietnamese played pirate, demanding a ransom of $10,000 per man. But neither the US nor the British government would pay a penny.
The British government would not pay a ransom, would they? They don't pay official ransoms. They always make a thing of, we don't pay, otherwise it just happens again.
By the 17th of May 1984, Fred Graham was free and returned to America, 40 pounds lighter than when he had left home on his adventures. His family and friends in California had raised the money, limiting his captivity to less than a year. The unfortunate Richard Knight stayed in jail. The British vice-consul in Hanoi wrote to Knight.
I know that Frederick Graham's departure must have left you feeling depressed, but please be assured your mother and friends are still working hard to raise the money to pay your fine.
After over a year in captivity, they'd raised only $2,000, still $8,000 short. Knight waited in prison alone through June and July. But then in August, the British consul wrote to tell him he'd had an extraordinary stroke of luck.
A particularly generous offer from a British citizen living in California means that the balance of the fine is now available.
In early August 1984, Richard Knight received the greatest treasure of all. His freedom. In the years that followed, Fred Graham's thirst for adventure remained unquenched. He succeeded in working as a photojournalist, and also, ironically, for the CIA during the US war in El Salvador. Now, he is an author of political thrillers. But Richard Knight never stopped looking for the treasure.
He doesn't seem to have regretted having done this, or having done it in this harebrained way. And he never lost the dream. I know he didn't lose the dream because, you know, when I last said goodbye to him, he was off back to China to find a backer to go and pick up the treasure.
Knight, stranded in China, out of funds and out of luck, telephoned a stranger for help, fellow treasure hunter George Edmonds.
Well, what could I do? I mean, he needed money to get out. So I agreed to send him some money if he agreed to tell me the true story. And I said, "Have you really found it, Richard?" And he said, "Yes, I have."
Edmonds never saw Knight or his money again. Richard Knight died in Carlisle in the north of England in 2002. So what is the truth of Kidd's legendary treasure? There's no doubt that he did bury a chest containing £14,000 that was dug up at the time on the orders of Lord Bellamont, Governor of New York. But what of Kidd's claim to have had a further £100,000 hidden away?
The question is, of course, was Kidd 100% truthful about how much shiny gold and jewellery he actually found and hid?
Did Captain Kidd really intend to guide a ship to a vast buried hoard? Or was the treasure a last desperate bid for his life? Did he intend, once at sea, to pull off a daring escape?
I'd be very surprised if any treasure is found, any of Kidd's treasure ever comes to light. I think Lord Bellamont basically managed to get his hands on the entire haul.
Nothing, it seems, puts off a dedicated treasure hunter. For George Edmonds, this dark cloud still has the glint of a silver lining. He believes he has properly deciphered the Kidd treasure maps.
The charts do lead to a treasure, but it is nothing whatsoever to do with Kidd.
Edmonds believes he has located a new treasure island where no treasure hunters have been before, just like Richard Knight, just like every serious treasure hunter. George Edmonds plays his cards very close to his chest while he seeks backers for his expedition.
I can't tell you where this island is because it is the result of 8 years of intensive research. Everything is in there. The solution of the clues on the charts and where this other island is, what the treasure is and where it is.
It seems that dreams of buried treasure never die.
So it's still out there. I'm very confident of that.